There's a kind of smile you can wear so long it stops belonging to you. For 2 summers. I wore mine over a wool cardigan in 90-degree heat, so no one would ever see what was underneath. My neighbors thought I was the luckiest woman on the 12th floor. They saw the corner apartment, the polished husband, the life that looked like a magazine spread. They never saw me count his footsteps in the hallway, so I'd know which version of him was coming home. I hid it for 2 years, and the one person on this earth who could look at me and see straight through the smile was flying back after 15 years away with no idea he was about to walk right into the middle of it. If you've ever hidden your pain behind a smile, stay with me. This is the day someone finally saw me. My name is Nora Merrick, and for 2 years the people around me believed I was living a life worth envying. From the outside, it was easy to believe. We had a corner apartment on the 12th floor of a glass high-rise in Raleigh, the kind of building where the lobby smelled like fresh lilies and the neighbors wore their success like cologne. They would nod at me by the mailboxes and say, I looked radiant, that Grant and I were the picture of a marriage done right. One woman down the hall told me, more than once, that I was the luckiest woman on the floor. I would smile and thank her and pull the sleeves of my cardigan a little lower over my wrists. It was July. The heat pressed against the windows like a second skin, and I was wearing wool, because wool was long enough to cover what a summer dress never could. That was the first thing you should know about me. I had become very, very good at wearing things that hid me. It wasn't always like that. To understand how a woman ends up counting footsteps in a hallway, you have to go back to a place where I never had to hide anything at all. I grew up in Boone, a small mountain town in North Carolina where the winters were long and the people were kind, and the brightest light of my whole childhood was my Uncle Ray. He was my mother's younger brother, 14 years older than me, and to a little girl he was something close to a superhero. He fixed bicycles for every kid on our block, free of charge, grease up to his elbows, and a joke always ready. He taught me to swim in the cold green water of the New River, holding his hand flat under my belly until the day he quietly took it away and I realized I'd been floating on my own for a while. What I remember most about him wasn't the swimming or the bikes. It was that he never once broke a promise. Not a small one, not a large one. In a world that taught me early how easily grown-ups let you down, Uncle Ray was the fixed point. If he said he'd be there, he was there. My father was the other steady thing, until he wasn't. He died the fall of my sophomore year of college suddenly, the way the strongest men in families sometimes do, leaving a silence no one knew how to fill. After that, Ray became the only father-shaped presence I had left. He drove 8 hours to sit with me at the funeral. He called every Sunday for a year. And then he took a contract to oversee security and operations on offshore rigs. Hard work in hard places. The kind that paid enough to change a life. It was supposed to be 2 years. It became 15. The Sunday calls stretched to monthly, then to a handful of texts scattered across a year. Distance does that, even to the people who love you most. It doesn't stop the love, it just quietly turns it into memory. I grew up in that quiet. I went to school for finance because I liked the feeling of numbers behaving, of columns that balanced when the rest of life didn't. And at a downtown networking mixer, a year out of school, I met a man named Grant Merrick. He was polished in a way that felt effortless. Confident, warm, impossibly attentive. What struck me most was his memory. He remembered the small things, the offhand things, the name of the coffee I'd mentioned liking once in passing, the town I grew up in, the fact that I'd lost my father. He would fold those details back into conversation weeks later like small gifts, and I thought, here is a man who truly listens. I know now that the ability to collect a person's tender places is not always tenderness. Sometimes it's inventory, but I didn't know that yet. My mother met him only once before the wedding. Afterward, she took my hands and said, carefully, the way she said things she'd thought about for a long time. He's too smooth, Nora, like a stone polished so well, you can't tell what's under it. I laughed. I told her she'd been reading too many of her paperback thrillers. I married Grant within the year. Uncle Ray was still overseas when it happened. He couldn't get home for the wedding, and I could hear the regret in his voice through a bad connection. When I'm home, he promised, I'll look him in the eye myself. I told him there'd be nothing to worry about by then. For a while, I thought my mother was wrong. That was my first mistake, believing the danger would look like danger. People imagine abuse arrives like a thunderclap. A fist, a scream, a clear line crossed. Mine didn't. Mine arrived so slowly that by the time I understood what was happening, I had already helped build it. Grant never hit me first. He wore me down first. It started with corrections, small ones, delivered gently, always framed as concern. At dinner with friends, he'd laugh and say, Nora tells this story wrong every time. Then tell it his way, while everyone chuckled, and I felt my own memory go soft under me. Later, in the car, he'd take my hand and say he only spoke up because he loved me, because he didn't want people to see me look foolish. He had a gift for wrapping a knife in a blanket. By the end of a night, I'd be thanking him for pointing out the very things that had made me smaller. The strangest part was how it made me doubt myself. I'd remember a conversation one way. He'd remember it another. So calmly, so certainly, that I began to assume the fault was mine. I started writing things down just to feel sure they'd happened. When a woman stops trusting her own memory, you don't need to lock the door. She stops trying to leave on her own. And slowly, deliberately, he cleared the people out of my life who might have seen it. My closest friend was Jenna Poole. We'd met freshman year of college and been inseparable for a decade. She was the one who knew my laugh before my grief, who'd sat with me the night my father died. Grant didn't forbid her. He was far too clever for that. He simply began, drop by drop, to poison the well. Jenna was a little toxic. Don't you think Jenna was always competing with you? Jenna had said something at dinner, had she really, that he was sure was a dig at me. He'd replay these moments until I started seeing my oldest friend through his eyes. I canceled on her twice, then 3 times. Eventually, I stopped calling at all. I told myself I was protecting my peace. I was helping him build my cage, and thanking him for the lock. There was a version of me that would have seen all of this coming. In college, I'd once stood up in a lecture hall and argued a professor down over a grading error, and won. At my first job, I'd reported a manager for cooking the numbers. Even when it cost me, I was not a weak woman. That's the thing no one tells you. A strong woman doesn't surrender all at once. She's worn down in stages until she can't tell fear from love anymore. The first time he hit me, it was after a holiday party. He'd watched me talk with a coworker, Alicia Reyes, for maybe 10 minutes. She was new, nervous, asking me which spreadsheet software our team used. That was the entire conversation, pivot tables and formulas. But on the drive home, Grant was silent in a way I'd learned to dread. And the moment our apartment door closed, he accused me of flirting, of humiliating him, of being exactly the kind of woman he should have listened to my own mother about. When I tried to explain, he slapped me hard enough that I hit the wall. Then something worse happened. He dropped to his knees. He sobbed. He said he didn't recognize himself, that his father had been a violent man and he'd swore he never would be, that he would rather die than hurt me again. He held my ankles like a man drowning, and God help me, I forgave him, because the crying looked so much like love, and I had already forgotten how to tell the difference. For 3 months afterward, he was perfect. Flowers, apologies, tenderness so complete it almost erased the memory of the wall against my back. And then it happened again. And the calm that followed was a little shorter this time. That became the shape of my marriage, a cycle of storm and sunshine, and the sunshine growing thinner every turn, until I lived my life reading the weather of a single man's moods. Somewhere in there, he took my job. I'd been earning well, a good analyst position with room to climb. He convinced me, so reasonably, that the commute was hurting us, that the stress was making me difficult, that I'd be happier somewhere calmer. "Let me take care of you," he said, and it sounded like devotion. I moved to a smaller role for less money. I didn't understand until much later that a woman with her own income is a woman who can leave. He hadn't taken my paycheck. He'd made me hand it over, and thank him for the room he left me. He never took anything by force at first. That was the genius of it. He took it by making me hand it over, and thank him for the room he left me. By the 5th year of my marriage, I could tell you what mood my husband was in before he ever opened the door. It was the footsteps. I had learned them the way you learn a language you never wanted to speak. The slow, even ones meant a good day, and I could exhale. The quick, heavy ones down the hallway meant I should already be moving, turning off the television, straightening the counter, arranging my face into something that wouldn't set him off. I lived braced. A body can hold that much tension for years and call it normal, because normal is just whatever you survive often enough. But here's the thing I need you to understand, because it is the part people always get wrong. I was not a broken woman who had given up. I looked like one. Maybe, inside, I was calculating. Late at night, when Grant was asleep, I'd sit in the bathroom with the fan running and read about divorce law on my phone. Residency requirements, separation periods, what a spouse was entitled to in North Carolina. I didn't understand all of it, but I was learning. And in the back of the pantry, behind the flour and the old cans, I kept a coffee tin every time I could skim a 20 without him noticing grocery change. A returned item, a little rounding here and there, I folded it into that tin. It was not much. It was the only thing in the world that was entirely mine. 2 things kept me from running. The first was money. He had moved me into a smaller job on purpose. I did not know how I'd survive on my own. And a woman who can't feed herself does not feel free to leave. The second was quieter and worse. It was the certainty that no one would believe me. Everyone loved Grant. Grant remembered your kids' names and refilled your wine and asked about your mother's surgery. If I told the truth, I'd be the bitter wife slandering a good man. His charm was his alibi, and he'd built it in plain sight for years. Then one night, something cracked the surface. Grant had left his phone on the counter, unlocked. While he stepped onto the balcony, I wasn't snooping. A banking notification simply lit the screen as I passed, and the number on it stopped me cold. An overdue balance so large I read it 3 times. Certain I'd miscounted the zeros. It made no sense. We weren't rich, but we weren't drowning. Where had that come from? He caught me looking. He crossed the room, fast, grabbed my wrist, and squeezed until the bones ground together. Close to my face, his voice low and flat. "Mind your own business." He held it a second too long enough to leave a bruise. then let go, and smiled like nothing had happened. I didn't understand what I'd seen, not yet, but some animal part of me knew I'd touched the edge of something. 2 days later, my mother called, and her voice was lighter than I'd heard it in years. Ray was coming home. His final contract was finished 15 years. Done. He'd be back for good within the month. Something in me that had been frozen for a very long time cracked open at the sound of it, and a warmth I'd almost forgotten came flooding back. The memory of a man who had never once broken a promise, who, when I was small, would have known just from my face that something was wrong, and would not have let it go. And Grant, in the weeks before Ray's return, grew strange in a way I couldn't place. Tenser, distracted. He was glued to his phone in a new way, and more than once he slipped out onto the balcony to take calls in a low voice, sliding the door shut behind him. Calls I was very clearly not meant to hear. I told myself it was work. I was becoming an expert at telling myself things. 3 days before Ray's flight was due to land, it happened over coffee. Not a fight, not an accusation. I had simply bought the wrong brand the store label won. Because it was cheaper, because I was still quietly saving 20s in a tin, Grant picked up the bag, read the label, and something behind his eyes went out like a pilot light. He shoved me, hard, into the corner of the kitchen island. The edge caught me across the ribs, and I heard the sound my own body made against it. The next morning, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and studied a map of pain across my side, dark and spreading, an injury no clumsy step on the stairs could ever explain. And I thought about Ray landing in 3 days, and my mother's voice on the phone, and the girl I used to be who argued with professors. I picked up my phone, and for the first time in 2 years, I texted my mother the truth I had buried. I told her I needed to talk, in person. For 2 years, I'd been waiting to be strong enough to leave. I didn't know I'd been waiting for someone to come home and remind me I already was. My mother's kitchen still smelled like the cinnamon she'd baked with since I was a child. I sat at the table where I'd done my homework, and for a while I couldn't find the words. Then I reached for my coffee cup, and my sleeve slid back, and she saw the ring of bruises around my wrist, where Grant's fingers had been. Her face changed. It didn't crumple. It turned to stone, the particular stillness of a mother realizing something has been happening under her nose that she'd ever let herself imagine. And that was when I understood something. I need you to hear clearly, because I know what you're thinking. You're wondering how a family misses this. The answer is that Grant was a performance, and I was his most loyal audience. He was charming at every dinner, warm at every holiday, and I hid it with everything I had. Because I was ashamed. Because I thought if I was quiet enough, I could keep it from being real. My mother had not looked away. I had made very sure there was nothing to see. I cried for the first time in months. I told her all of it at the party, the wall, the coffee, the footsteps I'd learned to read. She listened without once interrupting, her hand pressed flat against her mouth. When I finished, she didn't offer advice, or blame, or comfort. She asked me the only question that mattered. "What do you want to do now, Nora?" 2 days later, we drove to the airport to bring Ray home. I saw him before he saw me grayer, broader, but the same steady walk. He wrapped me in a hug that smelled like the aftershave I remembered from childhood. And for 1 second, I was 8 years old and safe. Then he went still. He pulled back, just far enough to hold me at arm's length. And he looked at me the way he used to look at a stalled engine reading it, listening for the part that was wrong. His eyes moved over my face, my thinness, the hollow I hadn't noticed in my own cheeks. And when my sleeve slipped again, and he caught the fading edge of a bruise, I saw something flicker behind his gaze. I yanked the fabric down and said I was just tired. He didn't argue. He only held my eyes a moment longer and said, quietly, "I believe you. For now." 3 words, for now. They sat in my chest the whole ride home, heavy as a stone in a pocket. He insisted on coming up to the apartment that evening to finally meet Grant properly, and I couldn't find a polite way to refuse. Grant turned on the full performance the moment we walked in the gracious host, pouring expensive scotch, asking Ray warm questions about the rigs, about the years overseas. But Ray had spent 15 years reading men in hard places, and I watched him sit back and gather details the way he once gathered symptoms. He noticed me tug my sleeve down in a warm room. He noticed how oddly, insistently, Grant kept steering the conversation toward the condo, how it was in his name, how the title was clean, how there were no shared claims on it, as if planting a flag none of us had asked to see. Grant stepped out to take one of his balcony calls, and Ray, moving fast and low, said, "Where do you keep your papers if you're leaving? We start tonight." We found the folder in the bottom of the office drawer, and what was inside it rearranged the floor beneath me. It was not Grant's debt. It was mine. Loans I had never applied for, credit cards in my name, my full name, my social security number opened over 2 years, run to their limits and beyond, cash advances, a second card I'd never seen, maxed out. My husband had not just been gambling away our money. He had been building a secret financial life in my name, borrowing against a future I didn't know I no longer had. This was why the condo was clean. He'd hollowed out everything else and buried the wreckage under my signature, forged in the dark. And beneath it all, handwritten, was a note and IOU promising a sum I couldn't breathe looking at, made out to a man named Desmond Kane. Ray went very still when he read that name. "How long has Grant known this man?" he asked. And there was something in his voice I hadn't heard before, something cold and careful. When I said I'd never heard the name in my life, he folded the paper and put it in his jacket and told me to pack a bag, quietly, tonight. For 2 years, I had thought the worst thing my husband could do was leave a mark on my body. That night, I learned he'd been signing my name in the dark. Ray did not throw a punch. I know some part of you wanted him to. For years afterward, when I told this story, people would lean in at this moment hoping for it. But what he did was colder and far more permanent than a fist. He made a plan, and he moved fast. The next morning, before anything else, he drove me to an urgent care clinic. "Without a report, the police have no teeth," he said. A doctor photographed the bruise across my ribs, the ring on my wrist, and wrote it all down, dates, patterns, the things a body says that a charming husband can't talk his way out of. For the first time, the truth existed somewhere outside my own head, in a file with a seal on it. Ray was not a superhero. This is important. He couldn't crack a case with his bare hands, and he didn't pretend to. What 15 years running security for an energy company had given him was something better. He knew which people to call. By that afternoon, we were sitting across from a family attorney who specialized in domestic violence, and beside her, a private investigator Ray trusted. The lawyer listened, looked at the medical report, looked at the folder of loans in my name, and said the words I'd been too afraid to imagine. "We can file for a protective order. In this state, we can be in front of a judge within days." A 50B, a domestic violence protective order. Not a threat, whispered in a kitchen, a document with a court behind it. One that could order Grant out of the apartment and keep him away from me by law. We filed that day. But the debt in my name had opened a door I didn't understand yet, and something was already coming through it. It was 2 in the morning when the knocking started. Not a knock, really. A slow, deliberate pounding on the apartment door, patient, unhurried, the kind of sound that knows you're awake and in no rush to stop. I froze in the dark. An envelope slid under the door, white against the hardwood, then the phone rang the landline we never used, and a voice I'd never heard said my name, my full legal name, and asked, very politely, when I intended to settle what I owed Mr. Kane. The men Grant had borrowed from had come to collect, and the name on the debt was mine. But here is what Grant had not counted on. I was not alone anymore. Ray was asleep on my mother's couch 3 miles away, and he was on the phone before the caller finished his sentence. The lawyer knew about Kane by morning. The private investigator started building a file of his own. The thing meant to terrify me into silence became one more piece of evidence, one more thread in a rope tightening around the man who'd tied it to my name. And Grant. I will never forget this. Grant was the one who broke. He came by the apartment days later, before the hearing, to talk me out of it, and while he stood in the living room spinning his apologies, footsteps sounded in the hallway outside. Ordinary footsteps, a neighbor, probably, but I watched my husband flinch. I watched the color drain from his face, watched him go rigid and turn toward the door, certain for one full second that Kane's men had come for him. The man who had spent 5 years teaching me to read the sound of shoes in a hallway stood in my living room, trembling at it. I had never, in all our years, seen him afraid. It changed his whole face. Ray had come with me that day. He stepped between us, calm as still water, and said the only thing that needed saying, "I don't have to lay a hand on you, Grant. There are people who've wanted a word with you for a long time, and they're a lot less patient than I am." Grant left. He didn't come back. The walls closed in from 3 directions at once. The protective order was granted at the hearing, and the judge ordered him out of my home. The investigator's file, handed to the right people, connected the loan shark debt to a pattern of theft. And Grant's own company, where he'd claimed to be an executive, he was not discovered missing funds that matched dollar for dollar. The money bleeding out to his gambling. They didn't prosecute him. A company can't. They handed everything to federal investigators. And a grand jury returned an indictment for fraud. Domestic violence order, loan shark at the door, federal charges. Every exit he'd built for himself had quietly become a wall. He'd spent years teaching me to be afraid of footsteps in a hallway. I never imagined I'd watch him learn the same lesson. There were 2 cases, and I need you to understand they were never the same one, because the law does not blur the way pain does. The criminal case for what he did to my body came first. Months later, these things move slowly. More slowly than anyone wants. I sat in a courtroom and finally said out loud, under oath, everything I had swallowed for 2 years. Alicia Reyes testified too. The woman he'd accused me of flirting with became the witness who confirmed how normal that night had truly been. An expert on the cycle of abuse explained to 12 strangers why a strong woman stays, why she covers for him, why it takes a returning uncle and a slipped sleeve to break the spell. I watched understanding move across their faces. For the first time, I was believed in a room full of people who owed me nothing. The fraud case ran on its own track, in its own court, on the federal government's schedule. When the 2 verdicts finally landed, the sentences ran consecutively one after the other, not side by side. Grant would not be leaving for a very long time. At the sentencing, he turned and found my eyes. and mouthed 2 words. "I'm sorry." I didn't look away, and I didn't burn. I had run out of fire for him a long time ago. "I don't carry anger anymore," I told him, quiet enough that only he could hear. "But I'll never call it forgiveness. You chose every single part of this. And here is the answer to the question I know you've been holding. The one people always ask about these stories: where did the money come from? If he was broke, it came from the truth finally being provable. Once the fraud was established, the debts forged in my name were challenged and cleared. I was a victim of identity theft, and the paper said so. North Carolina divided the marital assets the way the law requires, in my favor, and the court ordered restitution from what could be recovered. It was not a windfall. It was not Santa Claus. It was what was left after the lie was dismantled, and it was enough to begin again. One evening, after all of it, Ray sat with me on my mother's porch and was quiet for a long time. Then he said the thing I think he'd been carrying since the airport. "I keep asking myself where I was for 15 years while you needed me." I took his hand, the same hand that once held me up in the river, and told him he came home exactly when it mattered, and that a man who keeps one promise late is still a man who keeps his promises. Forgiving him, I found, was the first door. Because standing there, I understood I would have to learn to forgive myself too, for all the years I'd stayed. Jenna came back into my life the way spring comes back slowly, then all at once. She had testified, too, to who I'd been before he made me small, and afterward she simply started calling again, as if the lost years were a room we could walk back into. No one had abandoned me. I had been pulled underwater so quietly that even the people who loved me couldn't see me go under. Now they could see me surface. Some evenings, I still think about the small things. I went home one afternoon and took the coffee tin down from the back of the pantry and poured all those folded 20s out onto the kitchen table in the daylight. I didn't have to hide them anymore. I just sat and looked at every crumpled bill proof that some part of me had been planning to live, even when I couldn't say it out loud. Ray opened a consulting firm a few miles away and stayed close. He told me once that the most important moments in a life never arrive on a convenient schedule. You just have to move when they do. Months later, I stood alone on a beach on the Outer Banks, the wind coming off the water, and I did the smallest, largest thing. I took off the cardigan. I let the sun touch my bare arms in the open, where anyone could see, and there was nothing left to cover. There was no one left to fear. And I felt my own face do something it had forgotten how to do. I smiled, and for the first time in years, the smile was mine. Not a mask, not a performance for the 12th floor, mine. The mask you wear to survive is not the same as the face you were born with, and you are allowed to have yours back. If Nora's story reached something in you, tell me in the comments what's the one moment you finally chose yourself. And if you believe no one should have to hide their pain behind a smile, subscribe and stay with us. The next story might be the one someone out there needs to hear.